The 1960s were a decade of much strife and social upheaval. The world was affected by war and protest. Spring Hill was not independent from this phenomenon, with its student body, faculty, and clergy experiencing turbulence. The 60s brought war, protest, and social reform, which reached all across the globe. Spring Hill College prides itself on being the first school in Alabama to integrate African American students. Even though equality triumphed at Spring Hill, it was not without a great deal of internal struggle. This internal struggle is what we will explore throughout this documentary. This is St. Joseph's Chapel, a landmark of Spring Hill College in the greater Mobile area. St. Joseph's Chapel is the literal and spiritual center of Spring Hill's campus. The Jesuit and Catholic identity that Spring Hill so proudly extols played a central role in Spring Hill's argument for integrating African Americans onto its campus.
The two main camps on this controversial issue were headed by Archbishop Tulin and Father Foley, who were both prominent figures in the Catholic Church within the Mobile area. Tulin led the side for segregation, while Foley promoted the fight for integration. Tulin was an autocrat who ruled over Catholic Mobile with an iron fist. Tulin once excommunicated an entire family because they sent their special needs son to public school, as the parochial schools in Mobile did not provide special education. A staunch traditionalist, Tulin did not only represent the church, Tulin was the church. Foley, on the other hand, was incredibly progressive. Foley was originally signed to teach at Spring Hill in 1942. In 1946, Foley sponsored a meeting between Catholic war veterans and female high schoolers. This meeting facilitated social contact between black veterans and white females, a fact that greatly upset Bishop Tulin.
Mysteriously, Foley was reassigned to somewhere else in 1953. In his absence, Tulin and the Jesuit church, both relations became miraculously tense. Tulin caught wind that Father Lambo Mass for students only took 25 minutes. He then proceeded to write a letter to Lambo demanding that he deliver a sermon at every Mass. The next Sunday, Lambo read the letter aloud in St. Joseph's Cathedral and informed the students that he would be delivering a sermon. He uttered the two words, "Be good," and concluded his sermon.
To obtain a true understanding of campus reaction during this turbulent time, we interviewed students from the classes of 1960s. First, I interviewed Dr. Christopher Puto, class of 1964 and recent president of Spring Hill College.
I'm Dr. Christopher Puto. I was a student at Spring Hill College as a freshman in 1960 and I graduated in 1964. I was a trustee of Spring Hill College from 2003 to roughly 2015, and 2015 through 2018 I served as the president here at Spring Hill College, and I'm now the president emeritus and the founding director of the John Burke Center for the Study and Advancement of Free Enterprise here at Spring Hill College. Spring Hill College was very active along with the mayor of Mobile. So Mayor Joe Langen and Father Albert Foley worked together to advance civil rights here in the 1950s and early 1960s. It was a surprisingly peaceful time in the early 1960s here on this campus. Probably one of the more raucous events was when Joan Baez came and did a concert here, because she was one of the early protesters of things. But otherwise, it was mainly peaceful and quiet. Father Foley had his students who were part of his group would go out where the Klan was meeting, and they would take down the license plate numbers of all the cars, and then they would find out who those cars belonged to through the State License Bureau, and be able to report these ostensibly powerful people as having attended a Klan meeting. And so those were some of the things that were going on in terms of activism in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Well, I don't have a strong opinion on it, other than tension is a viable, good outcome of activities. So if everybody simply agrees on something, you can miss a lot of things. And so the tension was Father Foley was hoping to encourage Dr. King on certain activities and events, and Dr. King would listen and they would debate it. So there wasn't really acrimony or animosity, it was just tension. And what's really important about that relationship is they were both after the same goal, which was to create an environment for justice here. And one of the things that I think it's important to note is that Alabama as a state was going through a great deal of racial unrest and turmoil throughout the entire state. And the very least of that happened here in Mobile because of what Father Foley and Mayor Joe Langen did to bring the community together and keep there from being raucous riots and things like that. There was no dissension or unrest. Now, in the early stages, most of the students of color were Mobilians. And so the residential students and the Mobilians, irrespective of their racial background, didn't have a whole lot of places to mix. We didn't have a CAF like we have now. We didn't have a student center or anything like that. And so there was just normal interaction in class, and then people would go home if they lived in Mobile. So I can tell you for a fact that there was zero confrontation, zero animosity, and zero tension during that time. I would say it was what we call now the library field out in front of Byrne Memorial Library. Burke Library didn't exist when I was here. Byrne Library was the intellectual center of the campus, and so the library field is where we had all the intramurals took place essentially on the library field and some on Dorn. The ROTC drill day was every Friday, and all the ROTC students dressed in their uniforms all day on Friday, and then went drilled Friday afternoon from something like 1 o'clock till 4 o'clock. And so I would say that Byrne, what is now Byrne Hall, which then Byrne Library, and the library field were the main physical centers of campus at the time. There was not a major activity that drew a lot of attention. There was a constant feeling that we wanted to make sure that everybody had an equal chance at education and at a good life. Now, this was when I was a student here in Tuscaloosa and in Montgomery, Alabama. George Wallace was the governor of the state of Alabama, and he was making major confrontational statements about we're not going to integrate our colleges and schools. This was all going on in the early part of the 1960s. Television wasn't as broad, the internet didn't exist, and so we knew about it from the evening news and what we read in the newspapers, and we literally remarked that that was some craziness that was going on in another part of this state, and it was not going on here. That would be my biggest recollection of he was creating a lot of furor, George Wallace was, and we had a lot of students here from the Northeast, New York, and then the Midwest, and their reaction was, we're not going to engage in that kind of activity. We want everybody to be treated fairly and equally here on this campus, and that was the attitude.
Quote, Spring Hill was an island in a torrid ocean, says de Maranville, noting that while Spring Hill was not a Berkeley, it was progressive, especially for the state of Alabama. It was not overt, he said. There were not people out marching, but it was there. It was passively liberal. I asked de Maranville about his student involvement and he told me about a voting drive in Crichton, a black community. He recollected that these actions were discouraged by the white community in Mobile. Demeranville recalls the Ku Klux Klan being powerful in the communities on the outskirts of Mobile, like Saraland, Centradale, and Chickasaw. When asked about the relationship between Bishop Tulin and the Jesuits, Demeranville had this to say, quote, "I think Tulin was afraid of the Jesuits. They were morally right, and they were smart enough to express it," end quote. Spring Hill has always been a laid-back campus, Demeranville said, admitting that Spring Hill and Mobile as a whole were very quiet during the Civil Rights Movement. "I can only ever remember one loud incident in Mobile," said Demeranville. Quote, "We had been in Kentucky for Easter break, and when we came back, there was no traffic in Mobile at 11 p.m., which was very unusual." Demeranville says he later found out that there had been a riot at the Roger Williams Housing Project in response to the death of Martin Luther King, and that the city had been locked down and had enforced a curfew. Asked to comment about race relations at Spring Hill in the 1960s, Demeranville had this to say, quote, "I did have black friends, but there were very few black people on campus then. It must have been 1 or 2%. It was delicate. You certainly didn't want to hurt their feelings, but you also didn't want to overwhelm them. You wanted to be open," end quote. Demeranville states that there was no overt hostility to the black students on Spring Hill's campus, but he understood how a black person could feel uncomfortable.
However, though Spring Hill did experience some pushback on their road to desegregation, in the 1950s they were able to accept their first African American students into the college. This was after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, which later they got commended from Martin Luther King Jr. for accepting these students. Juliana Ponquet was the first to apply, along with 8 other African American students. The first of these students to graduate was Fannie E. Motley. She graduated in 1956. In 1957, they also accepted their first student athlete, which was Mark Chapman, and he was a baseball player. By 1960, Spring Hill College even had a club for African American students to join. In January of 1957, multiple KKK members came to the campus of Spring Hill College in hopes of burning a cross in front of the Mobile Hall dormitory. They did not realize that it was finals week and many white males were still up studying. When they heard the hammering for the cross, they came outside to see what was happening, and they ran off the members with softball bats, tennis clubs, and golf clubs. The next night, the KKK members came back to the school and lit a cross in front of the college gate before anyone was aware what was happening. The following day, a member of students from Spring Hill College, both male and female, got together and hung an effigy of a Klansman outside of the college gate with a sign reading, "KKKers are chicken." This was a very salient issue in this time. Father Foley also held a survey in Spring Hill campus and throughout Mobile to see what people thought about it around here. Although most people agreed that something should be done, there was also a group of white people that thought that this group was necessary and that they had every right to have this organization as long as there were black groups working for their liberation.
We discovered that Spring Hill did in fact lead the way in progressive racial integration in Alabama, but not without experiencing similar struggles to that of the many other civil rights movements during the 1960s. Contrary to the narrative pushed by the school today, there was conflict and strife surrounding the decision to integrate. For better or worse, the turbulence of the 60s shaped Spring Hill College, Mobile, and the world that we know today.